Because at that point, his people, God's people, were hopeless. This is life and death. And I love Esther's reply to him. If I perish, I perish. Today we continue our look at characters from the Old Testament, and we've made our way to Esther. And we're going to do this just a little bit differently because we're going to look at a couple characters in the book of Esther. And as I was looking into the book and reading the 10 chapters that incorporate Esther, a theme came to mind for me. And this usually happens as I'm reading and studying and preparing to give a sermon. And that theme was hope versus hate. What takes the day? Hope versus hate. And usually once those themes kind of come up, I see this happening in my life as I sit down and talk to people, this idea that the theme kind of is still relevant. And so as I was preparing for today, I sat down and was asked to coffee with a young woman in her 20s named Amanda. And we sat down for coffee, and the first thing out of her mouth was, "Why'd you hate me?" And that stung. I didn't know what she was talking about. And so I asked, help me understand what you're talking about. And she began to share a story of finding her identity as being an asexual, so that she knew that the church hated anyone that was in the LGBTQTIA plus community and had their identity in that. And I was taken aback, and I at first was not sure what to say except for forgive us. And then we started to talk about identity and how we don't hold on to an identity in sexuality, but in who Jesus is and what he's done for us. And began to share a story of love and forgiveness that brings hope. And thankfully, Amanda was willing to hear, and we're still kind of ongoing in our conversation. But this idea of hate and hope, it's still going on all around us today. And so as we look at the book of Esther, I want to look at it through that framework. And as we look at hope, I want to really look at hope for the hopeless. Because as we look at this book, that's kind of where God's people found themselves. And so let's look at a little bit of history before we get in and dive in. We're looking at the book of Esther. We really need to start with King Saul. And King Saul was kind of tasked with going and doing a lot of military maneuvers. One of those maneuvers was to annihilate the Amalekites. And as he went and he did that, he allowed one person to survive, King Agag. And he's going to come back into the picture in a minute. But from Saul, then we see King David and King Solomon. And then we see this like a rotating door of different kings. And eventually, they split the kingdom. And so there's Judah and there's Israel. And then we get to 2 Chronicles 36. And we see that both kingdoms fall. And that there is an exile. That means that God's people were taken out of their homeland and moved into these other regions, and they were kind of dispersed with other people and people groups who had also been exiled from their land. That was kind of how the Babylonian Empire took out and kind of diffused some leadership. And then we get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that we kind of looked at over the last few weeks. And then we get to Esther. Well, biblical scholars, people who are a lot smarter than I am have suggested that Esther actually takes place a generation before Ezra and Nehemiah. So as Esther is exiting, Ezra and Nehemiah are entering. So the picture. There's some fun facts about Esther, right? So one of those is that the name of God is never mentioned. There's no mention of God. There's his people, and he is interwoven into that story, but he's not there. The other interesting thing is, as we read the story of Esther from our children's Bibles, or maybe we've skimmed it, what we may not realize is that this story takes place over a decade. That there's 10 years of space from when we're introduced to Esther to when they celebrate and have a feast of something called Purim. So let's take a look and just talk about this story just a little bit. It starts with King Xerxes, right? King Xerxes the first, he's a powerful man. He has 127 provinces. They stretch a long ways away. And at the beginning of the book, there is this huge party. Huge, elaborate, days on days on days. 180, I believe. And they're celebrating. And so there's doing everything that God's people aren't supposed to do, right? There's a debauchery and adultery. There is drinking and just over consuming. There is all kinds of things with other gods that are happening. And so in the middle of this, King Xerxes asks the current queen to come and entertain the guest. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but she refuses. She says no. And here we get to see how powerful the king is. Because he writes this edict and he puts his stamp on it and says, she's disowned. The current queen, the queen of the beginning of the story, is sent away, and she no longer has the title or the means of being the queen. And so there's a search that goes on. And they find all of the young virgins in all of the land, and they bring them to the citadel. And they have a year of beautification before they have one night with the king. And out of all of those women, he's going to choose someone to be his queen after one night. That's kind of crazy to think about. That's really crazy. But in the midst of all that, we have this other guy. His name's Haman. Now, Haman, this is where King Agag comes back into the picture, because Haman is an Agagite. It means he's a descendant of that king, which means in his blood, there's this contempt for the Jews. Although they saved him, they got rid of the Amalekite kingdom. And so there's this idea that there's a juxtaposition. There's an opposite. There's an opposite side of the story with Haman and this guy named Mordecai. And Haman devises a plan to actually kill Mordecai because he won't bow down to him. Haman has reached this high, lofty place where as he walks the street, people are supposed to bow down to him. And Mordecai refuses. And so instead of going after Mordecai, he goes after all of the Jewish people. And he writes this edict, and he gets the king to put a stamp on it that says, on this certain day, all Jews will be put to death. All Jews will be put to death. And that is where we begin to see the hatred that Haman has come into the picture. And then you have Mordecai, and Mordecai is a key figure in this story because he is the guardian of Esther. He's her uncle, but he's also has a lot of wisdom. And in his wisdom, he's able to share about an assassination plan, attempt on King Xerxes, right? And so he gains favor with the king. He also has the ear of Esther, the queen, and gives her wisdom And some of that wisdom comes into chapter 4, where he says, who knows that you've been put in such a royal position for such as a time as this? Because Mordecai understood that there was a time, place, and space to speak up. Because at that point, his people, God's people, were hopeless. This is life and death. And I love Esther's reply to him. If I perish, I perish. You see, this has a double meaning for Esther, because as she steps into the king's chamber, it's a death sentence. Unless he raises his royal scepter to her, which he does, thankfully. But in that moment, it's life and death. It's either death because of the edict, the rule, the law, or it's death for going into the king when he's in a bad mood. Thankfully, he raises the scepter. There's these 2 meals with Haman and King Xerxes that happen. And at the end of it, she's able to plead her case and say, save me and my people. And Haman gets punished for the hatred in his heart and the trickery that he did. Esther and her people are saved by a new edict. They can't revoke the one that was there. But what happens is there's a new edict that goes out that says all Jewish people can gather and arm themselves during this day of annihilation. And so they do. They gather together in community and they defend themselves and they continue on. And that is an amazing thing. And the thing we see throughout this story is that God's presence with them is interwoven into the story, bringing a hope for tomorrow. And at the end of the story, they have this celebration. It's called the Feast of Purim. And as they celebrate that, it's a way of looking back and saying, yes, God has provided for us in these moments. And it's a reminder for us to look at through the hate that we may come across in our lives and into the hope, and that we also have a hope to share with the hopeless. So as I've looked at this story, the words of Mordecai keep coming back to me, because about a year ago, we started to look at what it means to have the Bridge ministry kind of come back into our strategic plan. And the Bridge ministry is really geared towards looking at young adults and connecting them to Jesus. And it's taken on a whole new kind of meaning. And we are very blessed at St. Michael to have young adults all around us, connected into the school, connected into worship, connected into all kinds of things. And so the goal there is just to help them find community and to gather and help them grow and know what it means to be connected to Jesus. We're also doing that at Emmanuel. The other part of this is being in the community, to be able to have the conversations with people who are like Amanda, who are eager to have a spiritual conversation, but they don't know where to start, and they may feel that the church has no place for them. And so over the last 6 months, we've been really blessed to build a lot of relationships. And for such as a time as this. So where are you at? What does that mean for you? What is the time, place, and space that God has given you? Because as we look at God's story, and we look at that gospel where Jesus is standing before Pilate, and Pilate, by all accounts from historians, is a guy who's filled with wrath and hate if you look at Josephus and some other first century historians. And Jesus is standing in front of him saying, no, there's more to the story. And he's giving a hope. Now, we know the rest of the story, that he goes to the cross just hours after that conversation. And then 3 days, there's an empty tomb, bringing a hope that is beyond anything anyone can imagine. So as you think about those words, for such as a time as this, what is it that God has placed in your life that you can bring hope for the hopeless? Is there a family member or a coworker or someone that you've had coffee with recently that needs to hear a story of love and forgiveness that bring hope? You see, we've been blessed in being connected to Jesus and knowing that hope that he brings. That he is interwoven in our story just like he's interwoven in the story of Esther. And that gives us something to share. And so as you go through this week, and my hope is that you will read through those 10 chapters of Esther, that you read those words as for such as a time as this. And someone comes to mind. And you have the time, place, and space to share about the hope you have. Because that brings hope to the hopeless. Being connected to Jesus brings us hope. Amen.